Okay, what we're going to do in this video is we're going to look at Polygon primitives. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to plot down a few primitive objects, and we're just going to go through a few hotkeys and just to try to get everybody familiar with how different objects are constructed within Maya. So I'm just going to zoom into these. Okay, so every object within Maya will be constructed by a series of transforms. So these are your transforms. So translate, rotate, and scale. So to access the translate, you would hit W on the keyboard, and that'll allow us to move it forward, up and down, side to side. There we go. To access rotate, if we hit E on the keyboard, we can rotate these individual axes, or we can rotate based on the camera's position relative to that object. And you can see there, that's no matter which way I kind of move around, it's sort of changing based upon the camera's position. Okay, and the next attribute is scale. So if we hit R on the keyboard, that'll allow us to change the scale of the object. And you can see there, we can change these individual attributes on their own individual axis, but we can also change them uniformly. So that's kind of neat. Okay, and then what we're going to do is just zero this out. So I'm going to set this value back to 1 for the scale, and then rotate and translate, set those back to 0. And we're going to move back to world origin. I'm just going to offset these. Right, so as well as every object being constructed by a transform, every object has its own series of inputs. So this polysphere has its own radius, subdivision axis, subdivision height. If we select the cone, it still has transforms, but the cone also has slightly different attributes because the object's different. So the radius, height, subdivision axis, subdivision height, subdivision caps. Let's just move along. And again, you can see it differs there ever so slightly, and then the cube is very different. So every object will have its own series of inputs which you can change at will. So if let's just select this sphere, and if you hold down Control and right mouse button, we can change this value on the fly, which is much more useful than typing in numerical values constantly. So again, if you just select the text, hit Control on the keyboard, it'll change like a little minus, and then just right mouse button on the keyboard and you can manipulate that value. So if I select the text, and see there how we can change these the shape quite dramatically based on these values, and these can be really useful starting points for different models that you might be creating. So you can see here how you can start off with something really quite different to what the base model would be. You know, the height we can adjust, the subdivision axis, you know, you might want to make something have far less detail in. And you can see here's cylinder, much the same as, again, you can see you're adding more subdivisions in, you can adjust the height, and same again with the cube. They all have their own very unique series of inputs. Yeah, so you can see the more subdivisions add here. Now you might be thinking, well, that's sort of great, but you know, how does that really help us? It can help in many ways. When you come to model an object, you know, you don't necessarily need all of this information. You might only need this to be set to 10, that to be set to 5, and that might be enough of a starting point for you. So before you go diving in and hacking into your model, it's something to be aware of. Okay, I'm just going to delete all of this, and then I'm going to hit F on the keyboard to frame just this sphere. Right, so every object within Maya has its own series of transforms and its own series of inputs, but also every polygon object has its own very unique set of components. In this case, edges, vertex, and faces and UVs we'll be looking at. So I'm going to have a little look at the edges, vertex and face and show you how we can manipulate those different components. But then in a separate video we'll look at the UV because it's quite a different kind of way of thinking. So what we'll do is we'll just start looking at the vertex. Okay, so now if you right click on the object, select vertex, and we can just select a point at a time. We just select it and we can manipulate this object, pull it up and down, select another component, pull it up and down. If you press up and you down and use the arrow keys, you can see you can move and manipulate around all of the different components. So you could move around sort of, again this works relative to the camera, so you can see I'm pressing down, there we go. So you can move around the different components, and that again will work based on whatever you have selected. So you can see there it's adding to the selection there, so you can see it's sort of spinning around, it's kind of cool, and then it's allowing us to go up and down the spans. So every object has its own series of components, and then we can also scale these out. We can rotate these around, and you can see there we're starting to really change the shape of this mesh. So if we started to rotate them, I would pull them down or up and scale them that way. So you can see there that we're getting something really, really unique and organic. So what you'll notice is when I'm selecting an object, it's moving in a very linear way. You can add to the selection, and do that you'd hold shift. So let's just pull these out, and you can see there that's moving in a very linear way, just this big kind of clump. To reduce the selection, what you could do is, let's say we'll have all of these, we'll select a few more here, and then if you hold down Control on the keyboard and then select the components, you can then remove them from the selection. So Shift to add, Control to take away. Another, like I said, this is moving in a very linear kind of way. If you tap B on the keyboard, you'll get this, and then if you hold B, you'll get this sort of radial fall off type shape. You can see there how it's yellow and you get a red sort of fall off from it. I'll just extend that a little bit more so you can sort of see that. And this will allow us to get a softer selection to the mesh, and what that gives us and what it'll allow us to do is develop more organic models and objects. So if you wanted to move things in a more linear way, just tap that B button, and you can see there it's moving in a very linear way. Tap it again. It's basically a soft select tool. And then you can, if you hold down B and left mouse button to make this bigger or smaller, you can see you're able to adjust that fall off, which is really useful. And that applies to any of these components, not just to face. So if I select this, hold down B, and then we can pull out this selection. If you tap B, it's going to take it back to being linear, and likewise with edge. See there, just very linear. Okay, the final thing to kind of mention is how we can change this, how this mesh is displayed. So at the moment this is at its lowest sort of form. If you tap 1 on the keyboard, this is how it would ordinarily be displayed. If you tap 2 on the keyboard, it will give us what's called a proxy mesh. So you'll have this low res cage on the outside and then a smoother mesh on the inside, and you can manipulate the low res mesh and see those changes take effect to sort of high res cage. So you can see there, that's quite useful. You can see there, you can model in very different sort of ways with Maya. And then you could just tap 3 on the keyboard, and that's giving you access to the sort of smoother mesh. One thing to point out is when you export and for game engines, let's say you want this mesh, let's just, what I'll do actually is hit Command D just to duplicate. And if I hit 3, you can see this is very smooth, this is very faceted. And I'm just going to open up the render panel, and have a little look. I'm not going to render it with Arnold, I'm just going to render it with software. But you'll see a few differences between these. These will look exactly the same based on the hardware. That was software renderer, so it'll just view based on what it sort of sees as a low res mesh. So if I hit render there, you'll see it's low res. If I tap hardware, change the different render engine to this, and it's smooth and faceted. So it's something to be aware of depending on what render engine you're using, and depending on how you go about exporting your models, particularly for games. Make sure that they are smoothed and that's set to subdivision level 1. Okay, so in the next video what we'll do is we'll look at UVing. That's its own thing, and I'll probably grab something from the content browser and go through things in a little more depth with UVing, because it can be quite a complicated sort of topic. Okay, I'll see you in the next video.